What happens when a simple decoration turns into a full-blown war? Picture this. A quiet, family-friendly neighborhood where everyone minds their own business until one woman, known for her iron grip on the neighborhood rules, takes matters into her own hands. It's just a few holiday flags, a couple of lights, or so they thought. But when one Karen decides that fun doesn't belong in her neighborhood, it all comes to a head. What happened next will shock you. Stay tuned to find out how a simple decoration led to a confrontation that no one saw coming. It was the grandest private event of the year. The entire neighborhood had been buzzing with excitement in the days leading up to it. The Smith family, like many others, had been looking forward to a peaceful evening in their quaint suburban neighborhood. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pristine lawns, the calm of the evening was shattered in an instant. Inside the Smiths' home, it was a typical Saturday afternoon, filled with laughter and the clinking of dishes. The family had been working together to set up simple, festive decorations in their front yard. It was just a few brightly colored flags, some twinkling fairy lights, and a small inflatable pumpkin. Nothing extravagant, just a little touch of cheer to celebrate the season. The kids, filled with excitement, were rushing to hang streamers and adorn the porch with festive little details. It was a joyous family moment, one that was meant to spread happiness and holiday spirit. But little did they know, the very decorations that brought so much joy to them were about to ignite a firestorm of drama that would alter the entire atmosphere of the evening. Out of nowhere, the front door of the Smiths' house slammed open. There stood Karen, the neighborhood's notorious HOA president, the self-appointed rule enforcer with a fierce obsession for maintaining order and conformity in their picturesque suburban community. Everyone knew her, her unshakable belief that she was the ultimate authority when it came to following the rules had earned her the title HOA Karen. Karen, with her clipboard always in hand, was infamous for her rigid interpretation of the neighborhood's bylaws. She had an uncanny ability to point out even the smallest infraction, whether it was a misplaced trash can or a flower pot that didn't meet her exacting standards. And now she had found her latest target, the Smith family's harmless holiday decorations. Without a moment's hesitation, Karen stormed up to the Smiths' yard, eyes narrowed and face flushed with indignation. She was already muttering under her breath about how the neighborhood was going downhill, and the moment she laid eyes on the Smiths' display, her anger flared. "You can't put these out here," Karen shouted, her voice carrying across the yard. Her eyes locked onto the colorful flags with contempt, as if they were the worst crime committed in the history of the neighborhood. "This is against the rules. I'm going to have to report you." A wave of confusion spread through the Smiths. Mrs. Smith, the calm and reasonable mother, stepped forward, a puzzled expression crossing her face. "Wait a minute, Karen, what are you talking about? These are just simple decorations for the holiday. We aren't hurting anyone." But Karen wasn't listening. She raised a finger accusingly, pointing at the small inflatable pumpkin and twinkling lights. "This isn't about fun, it's about maintaining the standards of this neighborhood. You know the rules about keeping things tasteful. The HOA guidelines prohibit these kinds of decorations, and I'm going to make sure they're taken down." Her words were like a slap in the face to the Smiths. Mr. Smith, who had been calmly hanging a string of lights on the porch, was visibly taken aback. "Are you serious? It's just a few decorations. There's nothing inappropriate here." Karen crossed her arms, her face hardening. "That's what you say, but the rest of the neighborhood doesn't want to see this tacky display. The HOA will be hearing about this tomorrow. I promise you that." The Smiths stood in stunned silence. They were just trying to add a little cheer to their neighborhood, something that, to them, seemed harmless and fun, yet here was Karen standing in front of them, ready to destroy the simple joy they had brought into their own yard. The children, confused and hurt by the confrontation, looked to their parents for reassurance, but there was nothing left to say. The sheer audacity of Karen's demand left them speechless. Mrs. Smith, however, was not one to back down easily. She knew Karen and her rules all too well. She had heard complaints before, even if they weren't always justified. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just about rules. It was about a woman who had taken her role as HOA president too seriously. "We're not hurting anyone. It's just a few lights. We're celebrating the holiday, Karen." But Karen was relentless. "You might think it's harmless, but the community standards are there for a reason. These decorations disrupt the aesthetics of the neighborhood." The conversation was going nowhere. The tension was palpable, and it felt like something was about to snap. Jimmy, watching from the side, saw the expression on his wife's face, the frustration, the disappointment. He stepped in between Karen and his family, his voice calm but unwavering. "Karen, we don't want any trouble. We're just trying to have a little fun," he said firmly. "Maybe you should reconsider how you approach this. You can't control everything." But Karen was not interested in reconsidering. Her eyes flared with anger. "I can do what I want. This neighborhood will stay pristine, and I'll make sure of it." With that, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed back to her house, leaving the Smiths to stand there in stunned silence. What had started as a harmless and joyful celebration had now turned into an ugly confrontation. The Smiths had always been model neighbors, never one to rock the boat. But tonight, something had changed. They were no longer just victims of petty rules. They were now in the center of a battle they never asked for. And little did they know, what would unfold next would leave everyone in the neighborhood wondering who the real villain was. The evening had gone from joyful to tense in a matter of moments. The Smiths stood in the front yard, still processing what had just happened. The vibrant decorations, which had once filled their hearts with excitement and pride, now felt like a target. Their simple holiday display had become a battleground, and Karen was the self-appointed warrior, ready to take on anything that didn't fit her narrow definition of perfection. But even as Karen stormed away, her words echoing in the Smiths' ears, they didn't give up. Mrs. Smith, determined to keep the peace for the sake of her children and her family's dignity, quickly stepped inside, gathering herself before Karen could file her complaint. The children, wide-eyed and confused, followed her inside, still unsure of what had just happened. Jimmy, who had remained calm throughout the encounter, took a deep breath before speaking. "Let's not let this ruin our night," he said, trying to reassure his family, but the frustration was clear in his voice. "She has no right to do that. We're not breaking any rules. I'm going to sort this out." Mrs. Smith, feeling a mixture of anger and helplessness, nodded. "We've always followed the rules, but she's going too far now." Their night had been ruined, but it wasn't over. Karen, the relentless HOA president, had left the Smiths with little more than an ultimatum: take down the decorations or face her wrath. But Jimmy wasn't the type to back down, especially when it came to standing up for what was right. After a few moments of silent contemplation, he turned to his wife. "I'm going to go speak to her. I can't let this stand. No one should be this controlling over a few harmless decorations." Without another word, Jimmy made his way to Karen's house. He wasn't angry, but he was determined to clear things up. He knew that confronting Karen would be difficult, but he also knew that sometimes the only way to change someone's mind was to have an honest conversation. As he walked toward her house, he steeled himself for what was coming. As Jimmy reached Karen's doorstep, he knocked firmly but politely. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing Karen, her expression as stern and unyielding as ever. The tension from their previous encounter still hung in the air like a thick fight, but this time it was Jimmy who held the power to turn the conversation around. "I wanted to speak to you," Jimmy said calmly, his tone level but firm. "About the decorations. I don't think you understood what we were trying to do here. It's just a little holiday cheer. We weren't trying to cause any trouble." Karen crossed her arms, her eyes narrowed. She seemed ready to fire back with another round of complaints, but Jimmy didn't give her the chance to escalate things. He kept his composure, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I know you're passionate about the neighborhood, and I respect that," Jimmy continued. "But you can't control every little thing. A few decorations aren't harming anyone. In fact, they're making people smile. Isn't that what matters more than anything? Bringing a little joy into people's lives?" Karen, however, wasn't swayed. Her voice was sharp and clipped as she responded. "You think your little decorations are the solution to everything. This isn't about making people smile. It's about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood. We have standards, and this," she motioned toward his house, "isn't what I want in my neighborhood." Jimmy stood tall, not backing down. "What about community? What about bringing people together? If you want to have a pristine neighborhood, sure, you can do that, but you can't erase people's happiness just because it doesn't fit your idea of perfect." The words hung between them. For a brief moment, Karen's expression softened. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in this way. Jimmy had done something that no one had done before. He had talked to her not as an enemy, but as an equal. There was a long pause as Karen seemed to process what he was saying. She stared at him, her lips pressed tightly together. Then, with an exhale that seemed to release some of her anger, she spoke again, this time quieter. "I didn't mean to make you feel this way. I care about the neighborhood, okay? I want things to be clean and orderly, and I thought you were being disrespectful." Jimmy took a step closer, softening his tone. "I get it, but you have to see that it's not about being disrespectful. We just wanted to have some fun. We just wanted to show the kids that the holidays can be about more than just rules. It can be about joy." Karen's face faltered for a second. She opened her mouth to say something, but instead she let out a long sigh, her shoulders relaxing. "I suppose I've been a little harsh," she admitted. "Maybe I got carried away. I just thought, if I don't keep the neighborhood in line, no one else will." Jimmy smiled gently, the tension between them slowly fading. "We all have our roles to play, Karen. I get that. But there's more than one way to keep things in line. We can still have a beautiful neighborhood without taking all the fun out of it." For the first time, Karen's face softened. She looked down at the ground, almost ashamed of her behavior. When she finally looked back up at Jimmy, there was a trace of vulnerability in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I'll, uh, I'll talk to the HOA about the rules. Maybe we can make an exception for next year. You're right. A little joy can go a long way." As Jimmy walked back to his house, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The confrontation hadn't escalated, and the conversation with Karen had actually led to a resolution. While it hadn't been an easy talk, it had been a necessary one. A conversation about community, joy, and the importance of letting people be happy without fear of judgment. The following week, Karen did something unexpected. She announced to the neighborhood that the HOA would be revising some of its outdated rules, including those about decorations. The Smiths' holiday display, which had initially caused so much tension, remained up, and Karen even stopped by to compliment it. The Smiths had not only maintained their holiday cheer, but they had also changed the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood. It wasn't about winning the battle or proving someone wrong. It was about showing that kindness and understanding can transform even the most difficult situations. And in that moment, the Smiths had proved that, even in the face of adversity, there was always room for a little bit of joy. The following days, after Jimmy's conversation with Karen, brought a surprising turn of events. While the initial tension seemed to dissipate, it didn't take long for whispers to start circulating. The quiet suburban neighborhood, which had prided itself on being peaceful and orderly, became divided. The story of the confrontation between Jimmy and Karen quickly spread like wildfire. Some neighbors applauded Jimmy's calm, thoughtful response. Others, however, took sides with Karen and began to question whether the display of decorations was, in fact, a sign of disrespect. For the Smiths, the joy they had hoped to bring to the neighborhood was now overshadowed by growing tension. The once simple act of decorating their yard had ignited a firestorm that they hadn't anticipated. They had been hoping for a celebration, something light-hearted and fun, but instead, they found themselves stuck in the middle of a suburban showdown. In the quiet hours of the evening, after the kids had gone to bed and the lights outside had dimmed, Jimmy and Mrs. Smith sat down on the couch discussing the ripple effect of their decision. They had expected a few people to comment or maybe express their opinions, but they hadn't expected the drama that followed. "It's strange," Mrs. Smith said, staring out the window at their yard. "It started out so innocently. A few flags, some lights, a little fun for the kids. Now, it feels like we've become the focus of everyone's judgment." Jimmy ran a hand through his hair, looking down at his phone. He had received dozens of messages, some supportive, others not so much. Some neighbors had reached out, offering their support and apologizing for Karen's behavior, but just as many had questioned whether it was really okay to bend the rules. "You know," Jimmy said, turning to his wife with a hint of frustration, "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to do something nice for the kids. But now, every time I walk out the door, I feel like I'm under a microscope." Mrs. Smith sighed, trying to understand her husband's frustration. "It's not just the decorations, though, is it? It's the fact that people are questioning why you do what you do. Why do you give so much? Why do you care? It's like they can't understand that generosity isn't a performance for you, Jimmy. It's just who you are." Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. "I know. It just bothers me when people try to reduce everything I do to something superficial. It's not about the spotlight. It's about making a real difference in people's lives. But sometimes it feels like they only see the cameras and the challenges. They don't see the impact." As the conversation continued, Jimmy and Mrs. Smith both realized that the real issue wasn't the decorations themselves. It was what those decorations represented. They represented a shift in the neighborhood's culture, a shift away from rigidity and conformity, and into something more inclusive and free. A shift that some weren't ready to embrace. The tension in the air was palpable. Jimmy had always been the kind of person who loved to make people smile, and yet, he found himself surrounded by people who didn't understand the power of joy. The sad truth was that Karen's outburst was not an isolated incident. In fact, it had become symbolic of a larger issue in the neighborhood, an unwillingness to let people live their lives freely, as long as it didn't fit into the narrow standards set by others. But things weren't as they seemed. While Jimmy was feeling the pressure of the growing backlash, something unexpected happened. The support for the Smiths began to grow. One evening, after the kids were asleep, a group of neighbors came by their house. They'd brought cookies and flowers, small gestures, but meaningful ones. These neighbors had been quietly observing the situation, and after seeing the unfair treatment Jimmy had endured, they decided to step up. "Hey, we just wanted to say that we're with you," one of the neighbors said as they handed over a small plate of cookies. "Karen has been pushing her rules on everyone for a long time, but we're not okay with how she treated you. This neighborhood needs more of the spirit you're bringing, not less." The words were a welcome relief. The Smiths smiled, accepting the support with open arms. But they also knew that the battle wasn't over. Karen still had her sights set on the decorations, and despite the public support, there was still a sense of unease among those who feared the wrath of HOA Karen. They feared her overzealous enforcement of rules would come crashing down on them too. Over the course of the next week, more neighbors joined in. People started voicing their frustrations about the HOA's outdated rules and the oppressive, rigid mindset that Karen embodied. They started questioning whether the strict, rule-based atmosphere of the neighborhood was truly fostering community or suffocating it. One neighbor, Mr. Green, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, had always quietly kept to himself. But when the decorations issue flared up, he took action. He took to the neighborhood Facebook page and posted a long, thoughtful message, urging the residents to come together and create a neighborhood that supported everyone's individuality and joy. "I've lived here for decades," Mr. Green wrote, "and for all those years, we've been stuck in this monotonous bubble, too afraid to let people have fun. It's time for us to start questioning these rules that seem more about control than about fostering a community. Let's be a neighborhood that celebrates the people in it, not just their ability to follow rules." The post sparked a firestorm of responses. Some were critical of the Smiths for pushing boundaries. Others came to their defense, encouraging a more open-minded approach to neighborhood regulations. Before long, the support for the Smiths wasn't just a few neighbors, it was a movement. People were beginning to see the importance of standing up for kindness, joy, and individuality. Even the children, who had been initially confused by Karen's confrontation, noticed the change. They no longer felt the need to hide the decorations or apologize for them. Instead, they proudly showed them off. And when they played outside, more kids joined in, drawn by the same sense of community that the Smiths had tried to create in the first place. In the end, it wasn't just the Smiths who had fought the battle. It was the entire neighborhood. The growing support meant that Karen's grip on the HOA was starting to weaken. The power of the people, united in the name of joy and kindness, was stronger than any set of outdated rule. As the days went by, the transformation in the neighborhood was undeniable. What had started as a simple confrontation over a few yard decorations had evolved into something much bigger. The ripples of the Smiths' actions began to spread far beyond their front yard. The ripple effect that started with a small act of defiance against a seemingly insignificant rule had awakened something in the residents, a desire to challenge the status quo and to stand up for what they believed was right. People who had been quiet observers of the HOA's rigid enforcement for years were now beginning to question the rules. Why should a handful of individuals dictate the atmosphere of the neighborhood? Why should the joy and expression of a family be stifled by an overzealous set of guidelines? And perhaps more importantly, why had they, as a community, allowed this to go on for so long without speaking up? The Smiths' small display of holiday decorations had become the catalyst for a movement within the neighborhood. Jimmy's calm and collected response to Karen's outburst, and his subsequent decision to confront her directly, had sparked a wave of introspection in many residents. They had witnessed firsthand how one person's actions could challenge the power structure in their own community, and they began to realize that they too could have a voice. Over the following day, more and more people began to approach the Smiths, offering support and words of encouragement. They expressed their admiration for how they had handled the situation. The Smiths' yard, once the source of conflict, had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that community and individuality were more important than conformity and control. One afternoon, as the Smith family gathered in their living room, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Smith opened the door to find several of their neighbors standing on the doorstep, including Mr. Green, the quiet, long-time resident who had previously been passive about the HOA's regulations. This time, he wasn't holding back. "We wanted to come by and show our support," Mr. Green said, his tone more confident than it had ever been. "What you did, it inspired us. We've all been living in fear of Karen and her little group, but seeing how you handled it, it made me realize that we don't have to put up with it anymore." Mrs. Smith, who had been feeling the weight of the situation since Karen's outburst, smiled gratefully. "Thank you. We never thought it would turn into something like this." Mr. Green handed her a small bundle of flyers. "We've been working on something. It's time we pushed for a change. These flyers outline some new suggestions for HOA rules that promote freedom of expression while still maintaining the beauty of the neighborhood. We're going to start a petition. The flyers included changes that allowed for more creative decorations, better communication with residents, and clear boundaries about the HOA's power. It wasn't just about bending the rules, it was about creating a more inclusive, community-focused environment. Jimmy, who had been listening intently, took the flyers from Mr. Green and nodded. "This is exactly what we need," Jimmy said, his voice filled with hope. "It's time we take control of our own neighborhood and stop letting a few individuals define how we live." That evening, the neighborhood Facebook page lit up with posts from neighbors who had been silently following the situation. Many began to rally behind the idea of changing the HOA's rules. It wasn't about causing chaos or disrespecting the neighborhood's aesthetic. It was about allowing residents to have a voice, to celebrate their individuality, and to create a community where everyone felt welcomed. The momentum quickly built. People started commenting on the post, voicing their support for a more flexible approach to HOA regulations. "It's about time we stop letting a small group control everything," one neighbor wrote. "We need to be able to express ourselves without fear of judgment." More neighbors rallied to the cause, many offering to sign the petition, while others volunteered to help distribute the flyers. What had started as a small conflict had snowballed into a movement for change. The Smiths, who had initially felt isolated in their fight against Karen, were now at the heart of a neighborhood-wide push for reform. They had unknowingly become the catalysts for a larger conversation about freedom, community, and what it really meant to live in a place that valued both tradition and individuality. As the petition gained traction, the HOA board was forced to take notice. For the first time in years, they had to confront the fact that their rules might not be as universally accepted as they had assumed. Karen, who had once been so confident in her authority, was now on the defensive. When the petition was officially submitted to the HOA board, it included signatures from over half the residents in the neighborhood, a clear sign that things were about to change. At the next HOA meeting, which had once been a formality with little room for debate, the room was filled with residents who had never before spoken up. People who had been intimidated by Karen's rule and the fear of repercussions now stood together, ready to make their voices heard. The atmosphere in the room was charged with anticipation. The change that had been slowly building for weeks was finally about to come to a head. Jimmy and Mrs. Smith attended the meeting, sitting near the front. As they exchanged glances with their supportive neighbors, they felt a quiet sense of victory. This wasn't out winning or losing. It was about creating a neighborhood where people could be themselves, without fear of judgment or overbearing rules. The meeting began, and the first order of business was the petition. Karen stood at the front, visibly uncomfortable, as the HOA president began to read through the changes that had been proposed. The room fell silent as the president asked for feedback. "Is there any objection to the proposed changes?" the president asked. There was a brief pause, and then a voice from the back of the room spoke up. It was Mr. Green, his voice now filled with strength and confidence. "I think it's time we all learned to live and let live. We're not asking for chaos. We're asking for flexibility and respect." The room erupted in applause. For the first time, Karen was outnumbered. In the days following the HOA meeting, something extraordinary happened. The neighborhood, once divided and defined by rigid rules, began to shift in a way that no one could have anticipated. The petition for change had gained such widespread support that even the HOA board couldn't ignore the overwhelming response from residents. What started as a confrontation over a few harmless decorations had evolved into a powerful movement that transcended the Smiths' original goal. It wasn't just about bending the rules. It was about changing the way the community viewed itself. As the months passed, the Smiths neighborhood became a shining example of what a community could accomplish when its residents came together with a shared vision of generosity and understanding. Jimmy and Mrs. Smith, who had started the process as humble neighbors simply trying to decorate their yard, had unwittingly ignited a change that went far beyond the superficial clash with Karen. The HOA, faced with such a unified front, had no choice but to revisit its policies. The rigid bylaws that once stifled the creativity and spirit of the neighborhood were now being revised. The new rules allowed for more freedom of expression, embracing individuality while maintaining the neighborhood's charm. Homeowners could now put up decorations for holidays, personalize their yards without fear of petty fines, and, most importantly, feel a sense of ownership in their community. The once restrictive environment had been replaced with one of inclusion and celebration. But even more importantly, the ripple effect that Jimmy's actions had created extended far beyond the neighborhood's boundaries. People across the city began to take notice of the change. What had started as a localized issue had sparked a larger conversation about how homeowners associations, HOAs, should serve their communities, not rule them with a iron fist. Many other neighborhoods, inspired by the Smiths' actions, began to push back against similar overbearing rules in their own communities. Jimmy's name, once synonymous with YouTube challenges and massive giveaways, was now associated with something far more powerful, a movement of kindness, generosity, and empowerment. It wasn't about his wealth or the viral nature of his videos anymore. It was about the character he had displayed in a moment of adversity. The ability to take a difficult situation and turn it into something positive, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. The waiter, who had initially sparked the entire conflict with his insulting comments, had gone through a transformation of his own. After his conversation with Jimmy, his perception of generosity had completely changed. In the following weeks, he began to understand the deeper meaning behind Jimmy's words. What had started as a simple misunderstanding about yard decorations had turned into a life-changing experience for the waiter. The waiter had always felt small, just another person in the background, overlooked and dismissed by the wealthy and influential people he served. But after his heartfelt conversation with Jimmy, he began to see his own value. Inspired by the humility and kindness Jimmy had shown, the waiter started volunteering at a local shelter, helping the homeless and those in need. His story, once filled with bitterness and judgment, now became one of redemption and purpose. The waiter's decision to give back to the community wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a complete shift in his worldview. He had learned that real success wasn't measured by the size of your bank account or the number of people who recognized you. It was measured by how much you gave to others, how much kindness you extended to people in need. Through his volunteer work, the waiter started to understand that giving, even in small ways, had the power to change lives, and it didn't need to be publicized to have meaning. While the changes in the neighborhood were significant, the true impact of Jimmy's actions went far beyond that one night of confrontation. Jimmy had created something much more profound, a culture of generosity. He had shown the people around him that kindness, humility, and the willingness to listen could change the course of a situation, no matter how heated or challenging it may seem. It wasn't just about the changes to the HOA bylaws or the decorations anymore. It was about how people interacted with each other, how they treated one another, and how they could come together to build something better. Jimmy had inspired a whole neighborhood to reconsider their approach to community, to think about the bigger picture, and to understand that living in a neighborhood wasn't just about following rules. It was about being there for one another and supporting each other. In the years that followed, the Smiths neighborhood became a model for others to follow. Other communities, inspired by what had happened, started to implement similar changes. The ripple effect was now a movement that reached far beyond the boundaries of that suburban street. Across the country, neighborhoods began rethinking their own HOA rules, recognizing the importance of freedom, individuality, and community spirit. Jimmy, the man who had once been just another YouTuber, was now seen as a champion of the people, someone whose generosity went beyond his viral videos and giveaways. People admired him not for the money he gave away, but for the way he had used his platform to challenge the norms and create positive change. His legacy wasn't built on challenges, but on the very thing he had always advocated for, making the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. The Smiths, while humble about the whole situation, could never have imagined the far-reaching effects of their decision to decorate their yard. What they thought would be a simple act of holiday cheer turned into something that inspired change, not only in their neighborhood, but in communities around the world. Their story proved that it only takes one moment, one act of kindness to shift the entire narrative. And that, in the end, generosity is the most powerful force of all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. Stay connected for more wild and entertaining HOA Karen stories. You won't want to miss what's coming next.